To put it simply, when women gained the right to vote 100 years ago, they also gained the right to employment, to do whatever job men could do, right? When that happened, women entered education. So women have to study, then women have to work. Because women have to study and women have to work, it means that they don't have enough time to have as many children as they used to. In the West, well, at least in Britain, the fertility rate has fallen to 1.4, which means that the population will decrease by 25% every generation. That's roughly every 25 years. As things stand, even with the migrants in Europe, it is expected that the population of Europe will be half by the end of the century. Without the migrants, the population will be a quarter, which means that migration's only going to increase because government, and let's remember, the rich are the government. Government are the rich. They don't want to lose money. They want to create economic growth forever. So this means that we have to expect the migration from the developing world is only going to increase. And here's the thing. It isn't that Europeans and white people are racist, and it isn't that they are anti-immigration. It is that the immigration levels has skyrocketed so far and so high that if you follow the maths, eventually the indigenous people of Europe will be replaced, but they will not be replaced by a hostile population of people. They will be replaced because people in Europe are just not having enough children. And the reason they're not having enough children is because the cost of living is so high that no one can afford to have children. Anyway, let's look at this video. I'm going to show you a couple of videos, and then you will tell me what you think. Let's start with this video.
Just when you thought things could not get more insane in the UK, we've just got population figures for England and Wales for the year ending 2024. They are mind-blowing. The population has increased by 707,000 people in just 1 year. That's 1 year. And if you look at all years since 2020 alone, we've added 2.5 million people to the population of England and Wales. And why is this? The number one reason, mass migration. Last year, in just 12 months, mass migration added 690,000 people to the population of England and Wales. That is equivalent to a city the size of Liverpool, comprised entirely of migrants being added to England and Wales in 1 year. The number of births has collapsed to the lowest number since 2002, reflecting how the biggest driver of population change in England and Wales now is mass migration. It's completely out of control. If you're interested in knowing what is really happening in this country in the West, come and join us at mattgoodwin.org. Bye-bye.
Well, interestingly, he touches on the fact that the population, the birth rates have fallen to their lowest points since 2002. And he's completely correct saying that over a course of 10 years, the amount of migrants that come in is the equivalent of a city. But then we also have to consider the fact that 10% of all people born in Britain live in other countries. So migration doesn't just work in one way, it works the other way also. The population of the UK is roughly 70 million. So right now, there are 7 million people born in this country who moved to another country, who migrated. So perhaps we also need to figure out how to stop people from here leaving and starting a life somewhere else. Because if more of them stayed, we would rely less and less on people coming in. Yet, the main problem is net migration, because every year 600,000 British citizens leave Britain for other countries. Over a course of 10 years, that's 6 million people. That's the size of central London, something like that. Greater London, I think, is 8 million. So if 6 million are leaving every 10 years, over a course of 100 years, you're talking about 60 million people born in this country are going to leave. So part of the reason that migration exists, it is to replace the people coming in. That being said, perhaps migration numbers should be capped or should be relative to the amount of people who are leaving. So if 600,000 are leaving, maybe only 600,000 should come in. What happened last year? 600,000 left, 1 million came in. So net, there was an extra 400,000 people officially in 2024. Yet those extra 400,000 people are equivalent to the amount of babies which are aborted every year. Roughly 350,000 babies are aborted in Britain every year. And that figure is roughly the same as the number of net migration that comes in, which means that if we found a way to slow down the number or reduce the number of abortions, then we could also reduce the number of migrants that come in, because 350,000 abortions a year, that's 3.5 million people. And if net migration is 400,000, in 10 years, that's 4 million people. So the numbers they are related to each other. The amount of babies being aborted reflect the amount of migrants that are being allowed in. So migrants are replacing the aborted babies every year. Could it be time that we relook at laws on abortions, or perhaps we could look at ways of helping women so that they feel that they can keep their babies? Because if fertility rates is 1.4, right, in the UK, replacement is 2.1. What this means is if you have a couple, a man and a woman, right, they need to have a little boy and a little girl to replace the man and the woman in the population. If the birth rate is 1.4, it means that for every couple, instead of having a boy and a girl, someone is having just one baby, right? So 3 couples that have a boy and a girl, 1 couple has just a boy or just a girl. So over time, this is how the population decreases. Let's look at this other video. And this is a vision of the future to come. And it's very scary.
This map should be a wake-up call. The people in the orangish countries aren't replacing themselves. They have sub-replacement birth rates. You probably already saw it on the map, but there is only one region in the globe that will have net population growth. 6 countries are going to be responsible for over half of all global population growth by the end of the century. 5 of those are in Africa. It's hard to exaggerate just how much that's going to scramble the geopolitical landscape by the end of the century. For example, when you think of Europe, you probably think old, wealthy nations, kind of an offsetting power block in geopolitical affairs. But Europe's population is projected to fall by 40% by the end of the century. All of Europe combined will have fewer people than the United States. And that's reflected in these lists. The only non-Asian or African country that is going to be on the list in 2100 is the US. Why is America exceptional in this regard? It's because our true superpower is immigration. We're making up for our sub-replacement birth rate by bringing in immigrants at a much higher rate than peer nations. This fact should also blow your mind. Okay, so those lists were based on dated information from China. Basically, they lied about their population statistics. We now have new data, and the current projections are that China, by the end of the century, will have about the same population as Nigeria. Think about that for a second. The way you and I have learned over the last 20, 30 years to view China as a rising global and economic powerhouse is how our children and their children will learn to view countries like Nigeria. Now, none of this is fully set in stone. In fact, the countries that right now choose to let in as many immigrants as they can are going to have a huge economic and geopolitical edge 50 years from now. Here's the thing. Our politics are wildly out of date. It is going to be bizarre to future generations to think that their parents and grandparents, us, were talking about trying to restrict the number of immigrations that were coming. It'll seem so obviously idiotic to them. Consider yourself a patriot or a nationalist. The best thing you can do to keep America great for your children and children's children is to welcome more immigrants, especially from Africa.
See, I actually call this, I have a name for this in my book, because I write philosophy mainly about game theory. With game theory, you have to look at the numbers. So what we are experiencing right now, I call the population wars. As he just pointed out, The population of Europe is going to be half the population of the United States by the end of the century. So Britain and Europe are trying to allow as many migrants in as possible in order to keep up with the United States and with other countries in terms of population. He even went as far as saying that the Chinese have been lying about their population because they themselves understand that if the population falls to a number too low, you will suffer in economic sense. Your economy will fall, and even militarily, you will be a weak nation. And this is why when people protest and they go out on the streets and they protest against migration, your government is not going to listen to you because the government policy is to try and let as many people in as possible. From a philosophical perspective, I think the strategy should be to increase birth rates. In Britain, in Europe, we should be trying to encourage and help people to have as many children as possible so that we don't have to rely on migration. But to do that is very costly. So the rich people, the government, what they really want to do is just get cheap labor, cheap people from abroad. They don't want to wait around 25 years for everyone to have more children and for those children to grow up. They want the people now. So in the West, for a long time, we have looked at the developing world, the rest of the world, and said, your women have no rights. We have believed that we are better than these people. But now that we see the population collapse, it's easy to understand why in the developing world women have no rights. Because as soon as women get rights, they want to study, they want to work, they want to travel, they want to focus on lifestyle, and these are good things. However, there is a cost to it. The cost is less children. In the developing world, the only job a woman has to focus on is having children. This is why people are having more children in the developing world, especially in Africa. One solution that I think from a game theoretical perspective, in the West, every time a woman or a man has a child, they should automatically receive a 25% pay increase. So if you want to double your salary, you have 4 children. Think about that. You create a financial incentive. And this makes rational sense because if we look at the past, right, when our ancestors were farmers and hunter-gatherers, for every child you had an extra laborer, an extra hunter. So you became wealthier. There was an incentive to have children. If you were a man and a woman, a couple, and you had no children, who would look after you in your old age? You would just die. Someone would take your land. You would be murdered. But if you had 10 children, 5 sons, 5 daughters, now you've got 10 people to help you out into old age. What we've done in the modern world is that we've relied on a pension system. So because people have pensions and they have money, they don't want to have children since they don't need their children to look after them into old age. Perhaps we need to reverse that dynamic. Perhaps we need to start making children responsible for their parents and for their old people. As soon as that becomes a thing, people would have to start having more children. Perhaps you could attach your pension to the income of your child. So, for example, if you create the incentive that your pension, 25% from every child that you have, right? There's 25% of your child's salary has to go into the parent's pension pot. This is game theory. My whole philosophical system as a philosopher is based on game theory. Game theory is about thinking about life like a game and how do you win the game using mathematical principles, right? So if your pension is attached to your children, if you only have one child, right, you would only receive 25% of that child's salary, right? But if you have 4 children, 25% times 4, then you have more money, which means if you have 10 children, you're going to have a better retirement than if you only have one child. See, from a game theoretical perspective, there's even a bigger problem, right? In every generation, women reject half of all men. Women only find 50% of men as a viable possibility for reproduction, which means that most women, like 95% of women, have children, but only 50%, 45% of men have children in every generation. For that reason, genetic studies have found that we have twice as many female ancestors as we have male ancestors. Now, because replacement rate is 2.1 children, 2.1, the zero point 0.1 just assumes that some people won't have children. So in order to replace the entire population, you need 2.1 children but that's for every couple. 2.1 children assumes that every woman will have a child with every man. Now, if only half of men have children, then realistically, it's 4 children per man and 2 children per woman in order to replace um the population. So as a man, as a British man, a European man, an American, if you want your country not to rely on migration, from a mathematical and statistical perspective, every man needs to have at least 4 children. But this only refers to 50% of men. So every man who will have children, which is 50% of children, has to have at least 4 children. And every woman has to have at least 2 children. But then this also means that women have to start coming to the reality that they have to share men. If only 50% of men have children every generation, then unfortunately it means that most women are going to have to share. They're going to have children with at least a man who has another woman or 2 women. And this is problematic because, according to statistics, 50% of men are monogamous, which means 50% of men, they only want to be with one woman. It could be for religious views, for romantic views. So if 50% of men are rejected by women, right, then we're only talking about the 50% of men that women are attracted to. Right? So if 50% of those men are monogamous, it means that 25% of men will always be monogamous in every generation. So the other 25% of desirable men means that they need to have children with at least 3 women. Do you see why we have a dating problem? The dating problem is based on the fact that our society has created a romantic view of reproduction in which there is one man for every woman. But the reality is that there are only one man for every 2 women, right? But since half of those men are monogamous, it means that for 75% of women are going to have to share 25% of men. So if replacement rate is 2.1, what it really means is that 25% of men who will have children need to have at least 4 children, right? Because they are monogamous. But the other 25% left, it means that they need to have at least 8 children in order to replace the population that is there. And as soon as you start to look at these numbers, you start to realize, one, why dating is failing and cannot succeed because all women want a man to themselves. 75% of women will not have one man to themselves. 75% of women are going to have to share 25% of men. So 3 in 4 women are going to have children with one man. And that is the reality from a game theoretical perspective. And since most women do not want to accept this reality, this is why fertility has dropped. Women don't want to share. Some women would rather have no children than share a man with 2 other women. Do you now understand why in the developing world, men never gave women rights? Because as soon as you give women rights, women are going to demand a world which reflects their views. A world that reflects a woman's view, a feminist view, will ultimately lead to the extinction of the population. And we are actually witnessing this in real time. Feminism has been one of the greatest experiments that society has ever created because, look, in the developing world, people force one man for one woman mostly. Like women are forced to get married. If a woman doesn't marry and have children, she won't have a life. So in that developing world, you don't get 50% of men being rejected as much. That figure is a lot lower. Now, when you think of Islam, Islam allows for wives. When you think about it, it makes a game theoretical sense because if 25% of men, right, are desirable only, right, and they need to have children with at least the 75% of women, then 3 women per man, it kind of matches up with the Islamic idea that one man for 4 women, and also with polygamy in the United States with the Mormons. It starts to make sense. And polygamy in Africa, it starts to make sense because in every generation, women will reject 50% of men. Why do they reject these men? Some of these men cannot provide financially. Some of them might be obese. Some of them might be disabled. Some of them might not be very attractive. So, from a game theoretical perspective, a woman's given a choice. You either share a man who is ideal, or you settle down with a man who's not ideal. And this is why women are finding the dating market impossible because women do not want to accept a man who's not ideal. So you're fighting for the men who are ideal. At the same time, it means that ideal men have a responsibility. If you want to save this society from a game theoretical perspective, I'm talking about mathematics. The ideal men need to have as many women as possible and as many children with these women as possible. And although this seems and sounds morally wrong, it is morally wrong, but it is biologically correct. Nature exists in the way that it exists for a reason. For example, lions eating gazelles is morally wrong, but it is biologically correct. You shouldn't kill another animal in order to feed yourself. That's morally abhorrent. But if you don't do that, you will die. So do we pick what's moral or do we pick what's right for our survival? And you see, the rise of the far right in the United States and Europe is a reflection that men have started to come slowly to this idea. Because what right wing women don't realize is that when the far right gets into power, one of the first things they're going to do is they will erase feminism. They will remove women's right to work, women's right to educate themselves, because the far right understands that if the population is to survive, women have to dedicate themselves to having children. And yet, this is sad. It is ironic. It is hard to accept. It is a bitter red pill. But when you think about it, what did women really gain from education and working? Because one of the reasons that people are not having enough children in the West is because childcare is too expensive. So right now, for you to pay someone to look after your child, that person needs to earn a salary, otherwise they won't survive. So the salary of you that you pay someone to look after your child is almost equivalent to a whole salary of your wife working. So in the past, when the man worked, the woman stayed at home and looked after the children, which meant that families spent zero on childcare. They could spend zero on education because a woman could educate the child. But now the man works and the woman works, but you have to pay almost half your salary for someone to look after your child, which doesn't really make sense because why by working the woman can't have as many children as possible. If the woman is to have as many children as possible, the woman needs to devote her whole time to having children. Now, 2.1, right, replacement rate, there's a problem with this because it doesn't reflect the reality of life, right? So it says 2.1 replacement rate, yeah? that assumes every man and every woman is going to line up together and have 2.1 children. And as I have pointed out, if women reject half of men, it means men need to have 4 children, right? Because there's only 50% of men having children. But if 25% of men are monogamous, the other 25% of desirable, they need to have how many? I can't do it off the top of my head. I think it's about 6 children, 6 to 8 children, in order to accommodate the other 75% of women who want to have children. Feminism has made this impossible because it means that we need to start considering polyamorous relationships. If we want to solve the dating crisis, perhaps 2 groups of 2, 3, or 4 women need to start pairing with one desirable guy. And this is an idea that if we don't accept this idea, the population decline is going to continue. See, what happens in poor countries is that there's not a great deal of jobs available, there's not a lot of tax, which means that the government doesn't have a lot of money to run the nation. And for that reason, it can't enforce the laws. When this happens, men, they completely disregard women's rights and women lose their rights. So if the population in the West declines, right, the West will become poorer. As the West becomes poorer, men will start to erase women's rights. Once men remove women's rights again and women can't work or study because the government doesn't have the money to protect them, women will start having more children and the whole cycle will reverse. So perhaps what I'm trying to say is an economic collapse of the West will lead to the resubjugation of women. The resubjugation of women would lead to women having more children, increasing their fertility, and then the population will rise once more. This is all just game theory, speculation, mathematics. Let me know what you think. But just to summarize, feminism has led to women having less children. Women having less children has meant that the economy cannot grow because the economy depends on workers. Every time the economy grows 1%, roughly 200 to 500,000 jobs are created. Therefore, you need more migrants. As the population of Western people gets older and older because people are surviving, they're spending 20, 30 years in retirement, you need more and more people. The real solution is to find ways to increase the population, encourage people of our nations to have more children. But that's going to take about 25 years since you need to have 3, 4 children. Those children need to grow up and then they can join the workforce. The problem is that governments have a short term look, they don't plan for the long term. If you're in government for 4 years in the USA, 5 years in the UK, your plan is only a 4 or 5 year plan. During that time, governments know that if the economy collapses, they will lose power. So they try to mitigate, allow migration to increase in order to grow the economy so that they can win another term. And although this is a short-term solution for the rich because it keeps them rich, it is a bad solution for the indigenous people of Britain, Europe, America. And so we find ourselves in the population wars, wars in which nations are competing to get as many migrants as possible so that they can remain a relevant economic force. But this is just a temporary fix. And this temporary fix will cause long-term problems. What we really need is a change of government. Not just a change of government, we need a new political system, a system which addresses the concerns of the real people of the nation. I propose a direct democracy. A direct democracy is a democracy in which everyone has a say. What we have right now is a representative democracy, which isn't really a democracy. It's a lie. They call it representative only to convince us to allow them to power. What we have in it is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is basically a small group of people who have all the power. The small group of people are the rich and the political class, and they do not care about the concerns of the real people. In a direct democracy, every time a government has a policy, it has to be approved by the entire nation. I will show you what a direct democracy is. We'll get into that, but Anyway, let me know your thoughts. How do you feel about this subject?